tanks coming from outer space, they feared that they were part of the enemy's new arsenal. Was it possible? Were the Germans developing a secret new technology, advanced far beyond what the world had known?
The Germans during World War II built at least 5 types of things we would call flying saucers. Today, if we saw them in the sky, we would say they're UFOs. Of course, there's some debate and some mystery exactly how these things worked. Starting with the most basic, the Foo Fighters, what the British and Americans saw in the skies, the bomber formations saw coming up at them. Most researchers believe these were simply turbojets mounted with some little wing that rotated around like a helicopter rotor. This thing spun up at the enemy and was remotely controlled. Through emissions of their fuel and through electronic mechanism in the devices, they would attempt to short-circuit out the ignition systems of the bombers.
I was a young fighter pilot in World War II, and I was a captain in the Air Force near the end of the war. And we began receiving reports sometime in 1943 of Foo Fighters, fireball fighters. They were balls of brilliant light, sometimes brilliant green and sometimes brilliant orange light, sometimes the size of a basketball and sometimes much bigger, that would get in formation with our bombers and stay there.
The Germans built about 100 different models of UFOs, powered with every existing engine in the German arsenal. Internal combustion engines, piston engines, rotary Wankel engines, outboard and inboard turbojets, pulse jets, ramjets, outboard and inboard rocket engines, spinning magnetic fields, basically flying electric motors.
Probably next in line in technical ascendance is the Sriever-Habermohl projects in Prague. These were spinning tops, essentially. These were jet or rocket-powered vanes, again, helicopter-like vanes with a ring that would surround them and a cockpit area above and below. So from the side, these would look like a perfect flying saucer. These things had, from the start, had problems with stability. And, of course, they went through test pilots at a fairly rapid rate. Well, after about 15 attempts, they evidently got one that ran fairly well. About this time, now we're talking about 1944, Sriever and Habermohl got some orders to drop their project and move to Breslau and assist in another project which was run by Dr. Richard Miete.
I had friends who reported these balls of fire appearing outside of the cockpit of a fighter aircraft only 10 and 15 feet away, and they did every maneuver they could think of, dives and rolls and everything, trying to get rid of this ball of fire out there, and it remained in exactly the same position no matter what they did. We knew that the rockets had been perfected, and we thought that most of these were simply a further extension of this rocket technology, and we believed that they were all being produced someplace by the Germans.
I was amazed to discover a whole side to the German technological development before and during the war that has never been published in the books. The Germans had space flights with about probably 1,000 different vehicles.
This was a little bit different project in that there was no outer group of rotors that spun. This project, you couldn't see anything spinning. The rotors, there were two rotors, but they were housed internally, so it was kind of a cowled helicopter, if you can imagine this, with a cockpit above and below. Also, other alternate engines were proposed for this, among them being the radial jet engines, which at that time many jet engines were radial jet engines, meaning that the exhaust came out the sides rather than a straight tube, and there were many exhaust outlets. So this type of pancake jet engine would of course fit nicely into a saucer, and the jet engines would not only provide thrust where you wanted it, but they could also be used for steering. It's said that on its initial flight it went up to 60,000 feet. The Germans make big claims for speed here. They actually claim this was a supersonic helicopter. As far as the Schriever-Habermohl craft, we have a letter from a test pilot saying he flew one. And he wrote it to one of the living saucer designers that we have located in Germany. So it's sort of a testimonial letter to him saying, yeah, I know who you are. You were a designer, and at least I want to give you credit for it if nobody else will.
English and French got in with Germany first, and they had these fireballs reported over Europe then. They got their name, Foo Fighter, from the French word for fire, few fighter, firefighters, or fireball fighters. And then the Americans adopted it, and then the English did, and everybody called them Foo Fighters after that. Mattern and Heydrich published a book in Canada years ago, it's about 15 years ago, where they described the German disc research program in considerable detail and published a map showing the location of 8 German disc research facilities.
They built a wing version of the V-2 rocket, which could fly twice as long as the usual one. And then they built a manned wing version of that rocket. Anyone who had flown that rocket would qualify for astronauts' wings here in this country, because you can fly higher than 30 kilometers, which is 100,000 feet, and you get the astronaut's wings.
The manned V-1 project was, they put a little cockpit on a V-1, the buzz bomb. And the idea was that they were going to fly these little buzz bombs and guide them manually and at the last minute bail out. Well, the problem here was that when they bailed out, they had no ejection seats, so they were going to bail out and try to avoid the incoming jet intake. So these were generally considered suicide missions. Hitler didn't like the idea, said that the kamikaze style was un-German. He said it wasn't worthy of Germans, and so he canceled the program. He canceled the program himself. Well, they had these pilots left over, so they moved them into the Geschwader 200, the Squadron 200, was moved into piloting these rather risky UFOs. In late 1944, Schriever and Habermohl returned to Prague to finish work on their type of flying disc. Both of these were called designated V-7. This was sort of a competition to get a V-7 type craft, which was flying, which was going to, of course, carry rockets and go up after Allied bomber formations, and kind of, kind of a flying platform. At that time, the Germans had not only rockets, barrage-type rockets, but they had rockets that were wire-guided with a 2-mile range. So you can imagine this thing carrying up several of these wire-guided rockets and sitting there calmly with little joysticks blowing up bombers. That was the idea. I have a letter from a test pilot. He claims that he tested one for a 250 to 300 kilometer, rides. So, we're talking about certainly over 100 miles of test flights on this thing.
Since the beginning of the UFO phenomenon, almost 50 years ago, flying saucers, if they are believed to exist at all, have been thought to originate from an extraterrestrial source. But there is a growing body of evidence that offers a more earthly explanation.
The electromagnetic projects were really 2 in Germany, one being called the Vril project, that's V-R-I-L, and the Haunebu project. Haunebu is an occult term having to do something with the column or tree of life supporting the heavens, which is normally thought of being in the polar regions. It's something to do with arcane mythology. The Vril craft, according to one of our sources, is an occult-based electromagnetic project. And what I mean by that is this Vril Society that was doing the experimenting with this craft in the late 30s, or the middle 30s, was not looking to build a flying saucer. They were looking to communicate with ancient gods.
Remember that about 100 years ago, if we were going from London to the United States, we'd do it in a tall sailing ship. And it might take us 6 weeks to 8 weeks to get across the ocean. That was the state of the art then. Well, we didn't build faster boats, did we? We invented the airplane. Now we go to London in 6 to 8 hours from New York. We still don't have ships that go that fast. We came up with a whole new kind of technology. There was a whole new kind of technology developed by the Germans in 1920 on Earth. They developed a better airplane. They figured out a way of using magnetic field energy and created metal flying discs. And they almost had those sophisticated enough to use them 60 years ago in World War II, but they didn't. If they had, we'd probably all be speaking German about now. There have been breakthroughs in technology, and that next major breakthrough in technology, magnetic field energy, has already happened, but they don't want to unleash that. The governments and the military are very worried about that because that knowledge, fallen into the wrong hands in second and third world countries, could probably rapidly bring forward World War III much faster than we need to. We don't need that kind of knowledge commonly known. We like to think that our airplanes, our Boeing 747s, or our F-16 fighters are the state-of-the-art of science on planet Earth. They are not. And once you kind of stop for a second and consider that, oh my gosh, maybe the U.S. military isn't the most advanced thing on the planet. And then you can think, well, maybe somebody else just found a different way of building an airplane.
These were private, basically secret society financed and owned technologies primarily.
Information was channeled to these occultists, essentially, in the real society, on how to build a machine to make it possible to communicate with the God, to be in the presence of the gods, is I think the way they put it. They built a machine. They actually had a scientist in their midst, in their membership, Dr. W.O. Schumann, who is a world-class scientist in electrical engineering. Built a device which looks like it rotated. In other words, it looks sort of like an electric motor. It had rotating parts. The interesting thing about this device is, I don't know whether it did anything for time or space or dimensional shifting, but what it did was it levitated. It rose up off the floor. So the Vril people began, of course, naturally got excited about that alone. According to the story, as it's told in Germany and Austria, the craft was then dismantled and moved to Augsburg. The craft was then, further worked and experimented on, and a whole series of these Vril craft were built, a whole series of prototypes, culminating in the Vril 1, which was a small fighter-type craft, an electromagnetically powered, designed by the Schumann Group, Dr. Schumann, who worked with SSE-4, a technical division of the SS. This craft was capable of traveling 2,500 miles an hour, so we're talking about beyond speed, way beyond speed of sound. And in their pictures, the pictures that we have of this craft, which look good, you can see, they're so close you can actually see the pilot sitting in the cupola, the cockpit of the craft. This craft had remote-controlled machine guns, which may or may not have been too effective, 2 types of machine guns. It also was scheduled to have a laser weapon.
Well, it appears at the time that German postgraduate scientists doing research in the University of Vienna became interested in the metaphysical library at the university there, which is one of the biggest in Europe. It was that group of pragmatic scientists that set themselves up, organized themselves into what they called the Tool Society. They were communicating with discarnate and possibly extraterrestrial intelligence and getting information. Inner group members that thought alike separated themselves from the rest of the Tool group and organized themselves into the Vril Society. The Vril Society grew quite fast, rapidly attracting a lot of scientists, middle-level scientists and senior scientists to it also, and they began trying to produce craft similar to the discs that were being observed. Then within that group, another cell emerged of inner people that called themselves the Society of the Black Sun. And it was the members of the Black Sun Society which became the SS Society. That's the symbol for the Black Sun. It's a black sun with the black rays shooting out of it and white SS and lightning strokes in it. And the SS became the instruments of reduction of the population.
A recently declassified CIA document from 1950 indicates that our government suspected that most UFOs were made from machines based on advanced German technology. The Allied governments had divvied up top-secret German files on a first-come, first-served basis at the end of the Second World War. Who had the flying disc blue book?
Well, actually, before the war ended, the United States and the Soviets, and to a lesser extent the British and the French, began scouring occupied Europe for German scientists. They initially were looking for nuclear scientists. And, of course, then they also rocket scientists. And, of course, they ended up taking just about anybody they thought would be of value to them. For instance, they tried to recruit and later did recruit Victor Schauberger, who was working on models of saucers for the Germans built that flew under a totally different principle. And he observed fluids in motion, specifically water, and came up with sort of a tornado spiral type of engine, which many people think of as being a free energy engine. Schriever got invitations to work in the United States. He also got invitations to work in South America from Nazis that didn't want to surrender. Essentially, it's the SS. And he chose not to do either and spent his remaining days, he died rather young in the early 1950s, delivering Stars and Stripes newspapers on trucks to Allied air bases or Allied bases in occupied Germany. Now, this may seem funny, but Stars and Stripes delivery personnel were used extensively by the SS to smuggle people out of Germany.
They were basically kept in low profile. They were preparing a dash for the South Pole to the colony that they've been quietly building up from the late 30s. And after 42, when everybody in Germany understood that they were about to lose the war, they would be slowly choked down. They started building that colony at full blast. By the time the war ended, they had about between 100,000 and maybe several 100,000 evacuees there. Elite troops, scientists, engineers, children from the Hitlerjugend to be the seed of the new colony.
They began decentralizing German industry. It went to mostly to Central and South America. Sent some factories and materials to their New Schwabenland, which was New Germany, as a matter of fact. Schwabenland is what Germany was called before we called it Germany. In Antarctica, the first mission was undertaken to Antarctica. The New Schwabenland was headed by Göring, Hermann Göring, in 1936, when he took a fleet of cargo ships and submarines, cargo submarines down there. By 1939, they had an established operating base there. So by 1943, when they have to decentralize and get their most advanced research, they're trying to get it out of Germany so it doesn't fall into our hands. And that includes the disk research.
The other electromagnetic project was a derivative, to a large extent, of the Vril project and used many components. It's called the Haunebu project. And here, there may have been some infusion of technology from Victor Schauberger in his work, and also infusion of technology of the ancient Indians. Couple this with the Vril technology, this produced the Haunebu type of saucer that we would call a flying saucer, or a UFO today would be easily recognizable by any of us. After the war, by the way, these craft weren't that great as weapons for a couple of reasons. You couldn't steady them because of the magnetic field these things would generate. They would tend to wobble a little bit, like, unsteady, kind of like a cork bobbing in water. Well, the Adamski craft, the Germans say, are Haunebus. That the Adamski took great pictures of Haunebus. I'm sure we had various models of German saucers. Certainly the conventionally powered saucers we had rebuilt by that time. We're not talking very complicated. We're just talking about a lot of work putting these things together, like building a house. It's not complicated, you just have to do the work. The electromagnetic ones were certainly more complicated, but were seen in the area in probably 50 or 51, certainly by a great number of people. So they were around then in the very early 50s, if not the late 40s.
Our post-World War history has been riddled with secrets and government cover-ups. But could an international conspiracy of this magnitude be hidden for 50 years? If UFOs are man-made, then we are looking at an international cover-up of staggering proportions. Is it paranoia or terrible truth?
One quite prominent, in fact, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist told me 5 years ago, he said, Whitley, if one word of this book is true, science has taken a kick in the shins because we've been lied to. He said to me 3 days ago, science took a body blow. We've been lied to, more than lied to. He said, I'm beginning to suspect I'm looking at one of the most evil things that has ever been done on this planet. And that is the concealment of the greatest secret that mankind has ever known. I said, you're jumping to the conclusion that it's aliens. And he said, of course it's aliens. I said, wait a minute. Let's be clear about this. Don't do that. It's implants right now. It's crop circles. It's video. We don't know if it's aliens yet. Let's look through the implants, the video, and the crop circles and see what's on the other side of that. Then we can decide if it's aliens.
When we return, what the Air Force was seeing nearly 50 years ago.
Whenever a country was overrun, there's a whole branch of the service that does nothing but collect the technical information. There were trucks with drivers waiting to be backed up to the factory facilities where the soldiers that were overrunning the place were looting the files and bringing them out to the trucks and loading them, and they hauled them away. Within hours of the fall of a town, all the technical material in the factories that supported the operation was being hauled away, and that was all collected and shipped back to the United States for study. Now, we collected it because we wanted to see what they had been doing. We also wanted to see what they were going to do, what their future plans were, see if they were running ahead of us or behind us. And if there was anything in development that we didn't know anything about, we quickly began a study of it. We were all doing this. The French were doing it, the British were doing it, the Australians were doing it, everybody was doing it. And if we had been conquered by anybody else, that would have happened to all of our documents or records. They would have all gone elsewhere.
The story, of course, is that, 30 countries are working on UFOs or UFO-like craft. Dr. Mehta worked in North Africa, in Pakistan, and in all places Israel before coming to the United States.
The UFO phenomena itself is multi-causal, and we're having trouble understanding it because we don't face up to that fact. For example, I studied vehicle interference reports. It was my first general huge project in ufology in the 70s. And there's a class of reports that involve car stopping, vehicle interference reports, that are little orange balls of light, little red and orange balls of light. They look like ball lightning, but they don't act like ball lightning. And they're a little bit bigger than ball lightning, and they hang around for longer than ball lightning, but they don't look like alien spacecraft either. And there's another part of it that I'm convinced in the last 10 or 15 years at least has been secret government aircraft, at least in this country. I don't think necessarily South America or someplace, but more and more the government is flying remotely piloted vehicles that have strange shapes. The Israelis in the Middle East, you never hear about this, of course, because it's top secret. Every day the Israelis fly strange-shaped planes over all the Palestinian areas in the West Bank. They fly it over Lebanon, and they're remotely piloted vehicles, basically to take pictures to see what the Palestinian rebels are up, and the rebels are up to. And the United States will do this. They did the same in the Gulf War, and you never heard about it because this is more secret than the stealth fighter. These devices, because they're so effective. Well, if they're testing these things out west, obviously we may in fact be seeing some of these things and think they're UFOs. Then, of course, there's a third category of UFOs which might look like flying discs and might be alien spacecraft. I'm absolutely convinced, like almost all scientists are, that there's life in the universe, you know, teeming with intelligent life. And I believe that it can get here, and it could happen any day, and it doesn't have to even be what we've been experiencing here. You know, for example, Jacques Vallée says UFOs are real, they are not alien spacecraft. Okay, that's what those are the two fundamentals, I think, of his position. They're real, they're not alien spacecraft. Let's say he's right, but maybe tomorrow the alien spacecraft will be here, and I think it's inevitable. In fact, that's I guess my fundamental point here. It is inevitable that we will contact alien life someday. The only question is, you know, when will it openly occur? Maybe it's already, of course, occurred secretly, but when will it openly occur?
Waking abruptly in the night, paralyzed, terrified, surrounded by alien creatures. Abducted and taken where? A laboratory? Spaceship? Laid out on a table and probed, surgically embedded with implants. Is this reality? Or is it a nightmare from beyond?
What happened to me first was at Christmas of 1985. I had a shocking close encounter that left me completely undone because it appeared to be an encounter with aliens. It was very violent and totally unexpected. Came into the middle of a life that was basically unrelated to the UFO phenomenon in any way. I spent months trying to understand what had happened to me from a medical standpoint, and eventually concluded that it was unexplained. I was very frightened by it and began to go out into the woods in the middle of the night to confront those fears. The result of this was that the visitors returned to my life, and that began what has turned out to be a 10-year relationship with them. During that period of time, so much has happened outside of my experience. Along the lines of first the crop circles began to come, things like the Mexican UFO videos began to be made. Now they're extracting implants from people. There's so much physical evidence of something strange going on that in 1986 I thought I had a medical problem. By 1989 I was fairly sure it was some kind of hallucinatory thing. Now, in 1996, if this isn't dead on real, I'll eat my hat. I have one question left. Who's doing this? Aliens or people? I don't know the answer yet. But I think that the presence of implants like the one I have in my own earlobe means all bets are off. This is real. It's physical. But what is it?
Disturbing stories of alien abduction are beginning to sound all too familiar. Missing time, bizarre medical experiments, post-traumatic stress. In America alone, over 1 million people have claimed to be abducted.
We can date this back to the turn of the century with a fairly high degree of accuracy and certainty. Anything past that, and we really lose sight of it. So it's generational, it's intergenerational, it goes back to great-grandma or great-grandpa or something like that, we think. Well, they say that they're taken out of their normal environment, they're rendered powerless, they cannot fight back, they can't say no, they can't say not tonight, I've got a headache or anything like that. They're taken on board a UFO, their clothes are removed, they're placed on a table, they have a series of mental, physical, and reproductive procedures that are run on them. There's primary, secondary, and ancillary procedures that are also run, which might be seeing babies, holding strange-looking babies, or seeing incubator rooms with hundreds of columns filled with fetuses in them. Or they might have visualization procedures where they're made to envision all sorts of things, which might be disaster scenarios or middle-class, mundane, suburban life scenarios. And then they're returned to their normal environment and they forget what happened to them immediately. They are not made to forget about it. In other words, we would expect to find a procedure which basically says you will not remember, you will not remember, you will forget, you will forget. And we'd expect to see it every single time. We never see it, have never seen it ever. It's not there. So in fact, what happens is there's a certain consciousness and perceptual alteration that occurs at the beginning of the phenomenon, which goes all the way through it, and that consciousness alteration ultimately is responsible for the amnesia that takes place. So the best way you can say it is that the memories are stored in an area which are not accessible through normal recall, but which are accessible through relaxed or focused concentration. Hypnosis is one way, and there are other ways of getting it as well.
I woke up one morning and walked into the kitchen to prepare breakfast and remembered what had happened during the previous night, little bits and pieces. I remembered that during the night I was lying in a round room, lying flat on my back on some kind of a table or platform, sort of like an examining table in a doctor's office. And I remembered that several entities that looked all alike, exactly like each other in every way, were standing around me performing medical experiments on me. And I remembered what they looked like. They had big, huge black eyes, no pupils, no white. They had no hair. They had just two little holes for a nose. I can't remember their mouth at all. I just don't remember. They didn't have any ears, and they were real slender and an off-white color. I call them a chalky color. And they were somewhere between 4 and 5 feet tall.
This is a reproductively oriented phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that's not interested in our defenses, not interested in atomic installations. They're not checking out the flora and the fauna. This is a reproductively oriented program. It is not a study. It is not an experiment. If there were any studies or experiments, they were done a long time ago. We don't see anything even vaguely relating to that, never have. We see a program.
I did not consciously remember at that point in time how I got on board the craft or how I left. And the only part of being on the craft was that I remember was when I was lying on my back. But I remember that the room was round, which I thought was strange. You know, I didn't see any corners like we have. And that's all I remembered at that time about that experience. But now, we have to put this in context here. In the late 70s, I'd never heard or read anything about abduction experiences. So even though that experience seemed as real to me as any other conscious, awake aspect of my life, I had no context in which to put it. Never having been taught about abductions in school or church, never having it mentioned by anybody, I didn't know how to handle that experience. So I said, well, you know, I've never heard of this thing happening to anybody, even though it seemed so very, very real. It must have been a dream. It happened during the night, so therefore, it must have been a dream. And that's how I rationalized it all.
I was thinking about abduction cases more in the late 80s, maybe 87 or 88, because they were becoming so prominent. And so many people were doing investigations. And David Jacobs, for example, first turned to abduction cases about that period. Well, what I realized is two things. First is that no one was studying the abductee in a scientific fashion. We were studying the abductee's story. Lots of people were recording the story. But I was interested in who they were, psychologically, sociologically, and so forth. And the second was that I was trained to do work in those areas. My PhD is in sociology. And I knew a couple people who work with the center who would be a good asset for a study of abductees and their characteristics. For example, we're getting slightly more females than males, which most people, we get the same percentage, but not overly, you know, not overtly 9 to 1 or something, but a few more females than males. We're getting many more whites than you would expect in population. And I think that has a lot to say about the cultural aspects of UFOs, more so than what aliens might be doing. Otherwise, they're very normal in terms of their education, actually slightly higher educated than the populace as a whole. Very much otherwise just what you'd expect in terms of where they live and their jobs, you know, and everything like that. So they're fairly normal with a few differences like I've mentioned. Psychologically, it's a little more interesting. Most of them are what we'll use the word normal in quotes. Most of them are normal. About 20% are not. Of those 20%, they show a diverse group of syndromes or symptoms or characteristics, with the schizoid personality possibly being the most common of those. But that does, even putting those aside, that leaves 80% of the people we've talk to or work with as being basically normal. Okay? Not having any characteristics that would lead you to say, oh, that characteristic must be why they say they're an abductee. Okay? Also, we looked in the fantasy-prone hypothesis and found out that it doesn't wash. Again, a very small percentage, maybe 10%, are what you call fantasy-prone, but the vast majority are not. Nor are they necessarily highly hypnotizable. There's a test you can use for that, and we found that most of them fall within the normal range of that, which means they're not particularly susceptible to being led under hypnosis, which is always one of the important questions people raise. And we looked at other characteristics as well, just odd psychological characteristics like out-of-body experiences. That's one thing we found that's interesting, is that most of these abductees do have out-of-body experiences. Now, the population as a whole is about 10 to 15%, say they've had an out-of-body experience. Our abductee population is 60%.
And I woke up, and I remember sitting up from my waist up, and there was something holding my legs, holding onto my legs, and I lifted up, and my legs were spread apart, and there were 3 small gray beings around my legs. And I always interpreted it as being something sexual because that's where they were, but no other clue beyond that. I woke up and I sat up and I looked at them at very close range, and the next memory I have was floating out the window and going up, and it was cold, and went to a craft, a gray metallic craft that was above the house, not too far above, and it had a humming noise to it, and in the roundness of the craft, I remember the roundness of the craft as I was going up, the metallic gray, a humming noise, and the color. Went into the craft and have no memory of anything happening in the craft until I was leaving, and as I left, there was a tall, blonde, 8 foot, now, if I'm off 6 inches, I'm off, but I looked up at him, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, he had long blonde hair and was wearing white, and said, "Do not be afraid of the unknown."
Coming up, more stories of alleged alien contact.
I had experiences that I remember just little bits and pieces of, like I might remember a force field taking me out of the house, or having me lying horizontally over my bed, and I started having flashbacks of the big black eyes staring into my eyes. I think it's possible that I was having the experiences periodically throughout that entire period of time, but something was blocking my memory. The way I relate it to my ET experience is that I believe that our government military have erased portions of my memory intentionally.
Woke up in the middle of the night, and I was awakened by the fact that I felt like I was in motion. And I turned out to be in a little room full of what looked to me like gigantic insects, which were peering at me. I thought it was a nightmare, and I kept trying to wake up from the nightmare, but the nightmare was happening while I was awake. I was not home in my bed anymore. I was in an entirely different place. And they fired a needle into the side of my head. They did a rectal probe into my body. There was a voice, like an electronic voice, going, "What can we do to help you stop screaming?" It was an appalling experience. It was indistinguishable from real life, except as I understood real life at that time, it was something that couldn't happen. That was the first experience. Subsequently, there were many different types of experience, close approaches, encounters, other abductions that eventually led to a situation that I live in now, where there's a very formal structure to the encounters, and they come only at particular moments, like I needed some information for the last chapter of the book I'm writing. I needed it from the visitors. There was no one else who could give it to me. There was an encounter, and I received the information I needed for the book. That's the kind of thing that happens now. In other words, it's become communication. At first, it was just dead-on attack. Now it's much more communicative. My fear at that time, even while I was having the experience, was primarily not a fear of them, but a fear of the fact that I could not get out of this, because I thought I had become psychotic and that I could not escape from a hallucinatory horror. Of course, the thing is, it was not a hallucination. That's very clear to me now. It's been 10 years of questioning and searching for me to come to the point where I would say that. However, you can't not say that now. There's too much evidence that someone is here. And the reason I've changed my position so much over these past few years, implants are being physically taken out of people. We don't know whether or not, if you got past all of the interference, you wouldn't find soldiers putting it into it. Or it might be there really are aliens out there doing it. We just can't be sure of anything right now. This is a time not for answers, but for questions.